Okay, so it looks like a little thing up says webinar is now streaming live on custom live streaming service.
I see it.
So let's go ahead. We can start with some introductions. I'm MileHiCon. I'm going to be the moderator today. When we do our introductions, let's see if we can tell a bit about yourself and your creative work and how many children you've had a part in creating. I'm a writer, dabbled a little in art, and I have created 5 kids. So let's try, I guess, just alphabetical order by last name. So that would mean Lou J, you're first.
All right. I've got, you can hear me, yes? I've got short stories out there and mostly magazine and anthologies. I've got one self-published short story. I've got a novella that I did as a work for hire, but I still like it. I mean, I can still I put my name on it. She was fine with that. And this is the year I'm working on my first novel. I've tried to start this thing a couple times, so we'll see how it goes. But I'm based in Denver, and that's basically me. Oh, 3 kids. 3 kids. I like to throw in that I know of, but that's really not so funny as it was when I was younger. So.
Okay, David, I think up next.
Yeah, I'm next. Excuse me, I'm David Dvorkin. I'm a local in Denver. I've been attending MileHiCon for decades now. In fact, MileHiCon is, what, 1 year older than my marriage, I think, or
no, it's the same, 52
same.
years.
It's the same as our marriage. That's right. We have one kid who actually practically grew up at MileHiCon and now attends as a panelist. I have mostly written novels, very few short stories that have been published. This is my latest one. It's book number 30, Randolph Runner. It's a satire about politics and robots and automation, and it has sex and violence, and I hope lots of humor in it as well. That's it.
James, I can't hear you. I think you're still muted.
Okay, there you go. I didn't know I had to unmute myself. I'm James Van Pelt. I mostly write short fiction. I have a collection, Best of James Van Pelt, that was supposed to debut here at Mile High, so I guess it is. This is what it looks like. It's fat. It's a big, fat book that has the best of 30 years of publishing short stories. So I was signing and numbering them. It's a limited edition collectible thing. Let me see, I can put a link there. Oh, that just goes to panelists. I want that to go to everybody. I have 3 children, and they all attended MileHiCon numerous times. They were there last year. I took them to other conventions too. My middle son and I were at Worldcon together at Kansas City, or my oldest son at Worldcon in Kansas City because he was living in Kansas City. And my middle one came to World Fantasy last year before last. And he has published some short stories. We even shared a table of contents once.
Well, cool. Sounds good. So how do you now, or how have you in the past been able to balance your creative work and the kids and spouses and careers and all the stuff that goes with it?
Still want to go alphabetical?
Oh, we can just, whoever has the thought, take it away.
You go, James.
Well, I taught high school English for 36 years or so. And English teaching of any kind, but certainly teaching English can be all-consuming. So you have to learn how to carve time out to do the other things like parenting and writing and being a good spouse. It was pretty much just a juggling act the whole way through. Fortunately for my writing life, when I was writing, my family wasn't awake most of the time. I was either writing before school when my kids started going to high school, they came to my school. That was a school of choice thing, and it was a pretty long drive. So they just took a bedroll with them and then slept until class started. So they were effectively not there. I'd write in the morning. I'd write during planning period. I'd write during meetings. I'd write while they were doing sports after school. And then when I got home, I'm just parenting, and I didn't do much writing at home during the school year. In fact, I probably got less writing done during the summer than I did during the school year, because I had more segments of time that I could write with during the school year. During the summer, I was doing family stuff. So, vacationing and paying attention to the kids, and yard work, which whatever little amount of yard work I could get away with doing, that's how I do it. So I didn't really have a plan. I'm not a spreadsheet kind of person. I didn't build job lists for the kids or for myself. I just, when there was a chance to do the stuff I wanted to do for writing, I did it. And the rest of the time I was doing things for them or for the family, or I was just being lazy.
Well, as I remember, I did not get a lot of sleep for for many decades. Actually, but the parenting, that was because of work and other things. But the parenting part wasn't a problem. Once Daniel learned to read for himself and didn't have to be read to, then basically he would disappear most of the time and into a pile of books. I used to take him to public libraries on Saturdays, and we'd come home with an enormous pile of books, which he would then get through by Monday or Tuesday, and then he'd reread them all again. He'd reread all of those books 2 or 3 times until the next Saturday we'd go to another library. We went to different branches of the Denver Public Library every Saturday in hopes that they would have a different selection of books. He'd raid them all. That really wasn't a problem. And in fact, later when he became a teenager, he was writing himself, and his first published book was a collaboration, a Star Trek novel that he and I wrote together. So I wouldn't say parenting wasn't a problem. He was in many ways a creative partner, read things, make suggestions, ideas back and forth, and he's always so scientifically oriented that I could pick his brains all the time, even when he was quite young. It was really great. That wasn't really a problem. Actually, for me, just the job was the problem. And now that I'm retired, that's not a problem either anymore. It's actually been it seems in retrospect like a smooth ride, though it didn't seem like it at the time.
I love your story of taking your son to the library and a stack of books. The only one of my 3 kids that really liked to read was my daughter, and she was into a genre that I'm not as much into. She was a deep Harry Potter fan, and I got the pleasure of taking her down to Orlando when they opened up Harry Potter World in whatever park that was, and just to see her walking around and looking. I bought her a butter beer, and I've got a picture of with a froth on her upper lip. It was a terrible concoction, overly sweet caramel lemonade something. It was nasty, but she loved it, and she liked walking around in the reality of what she'd only imagined in her head. And my son, you said you shared a table of contents, James, with your son. Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
My son, I wanted him to write something with me because he's got a very vivid imagination. He likes video games, but my youngest son, he's 15. So a few years ago, I said, look, I want to write a story with you. And, what do you want to write about? And he goes, I like swords and unicorns and ogres. And I'm like, great, we can write about that. What do you want to do? I want the person with a sword to just kill all the ogres. And so I'm like, well, what's wrong with the ogres? And we went through the plotting of the story, and I would push back, and finally I'm like, well, why does the main character have to be a boy? Why? Just why? And he said, Dad, I don't want to argue with you about this. If you want to make it a girl, make it a girl. All right, but I'll put your name in there. So Ian, my son, the name of the main character in this story was a young girl named Jillian. And so we wrote this together, and by writing it together, I would stop writing and I'd run over to him and say, what's the inciting incident? And he'd look at me like, what? I'm like, why are we here at all? Oh, because her parents are bullies. Aha! And then back I'd go, and we'd write it. And I'd write it, and I wrote it all out, and he refused to read it. He said, Dad, this is more than 2 pages. I can't read it. So I submitted it to an anthology about swords, sorcery, and damsels in distress, and which was perfect because it had swords. Damsels in distress, and we got in. And it paid pro rates, and so there he is. He's in print, and I'm like, look in this book, you, me, this story that we wrote together that you refused to read. He goes, yeah, it's too long. So he's published. He's now 15, and what I've threatened to do is to go to his high school and just read it aloud to a packed auditorium. Attention, Ian Berger here, sitting right there, little spotlight, just to humiliate him. And then say, do you remember what happens next? And he would shake his head because he won't read it. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Oh, that's beautiful. It's beautiful. A little off in left field here, but when I was a kid, I was a strange child. I admit I was a strange child. I'm strange now. Nothing much has changed, but I would take notes on what my parents were doing, particularly the creative ways that they found to deal with us. And one of the most beautiful things that I remember, even as like a 4-year-old kid, going, oh, this is good. I gotta remember this one. This is good. Is we never ever whined or fussed or created a scene in public in a store because we wanted something. Because if you did, my dad would critique your temper tantrum. He would start just shouting, you're doing it wrong. You're supposed to flail your arms and kick your feet. If you don't do that, how's anybody gonna take you seriously? And you've got to project your voice so the people 4 aisles over can hear you. If other people can't hear you, how is this gonna make any difference to anything? And you just stopped dead and went on with your life because people for the last, next several aisles were laughing hysterically. And I remember thinking as a child, oh, that's good. That's really good. And I used it on my kids. And I've come up with some other creative ways of dealing with some of the things the kids do. Can you tell us about some of the creative ways that you dealt with your kids?
Oh, I'm afraid they might hear this video. I've got some, but James is safe. James, you go first.
What?
You're safe. You're nicer than I am.
My boys are all tech savvy. They could drop in at any moment, or
Right.
this stuff is recorded. If I tell stories about them, I'm sure I'll get in trouble in some way or another. Creative ways. Yeah, both my wife and I took sort of a free range approach to our kids, which is funny because I have 2 sisters who have children, and we all have very different parenting styles, and so it's interesting to watch how they parented and how we parented. And so we let them read what they wanted to read. When my oldest got interested in computers, we said, okay, good, well, we'll get you a computer. And then, he immediately deleted all the stuff on it because he thought he needed room, including the operating system. And so we go, okay, well, that was kind of an expensive lesson. We learned something there, didn't we? And but it seems to have worked out. My oldest is a big gamer. He still is a gamer. He's 30. He did some writing. He entered a story in the MileHiCon short story writing contest. They don't have it every year, but they did that year. And he was the only person in his age group, so he won. And it was a nice story. I liked his story. My youngest son is a big gamer. He's 23, and he's still, we support him that when they went through the Pokemon phase, we bought him cards. We just encouraged them to follow the things that they wanted to follow. If they were interested, we wanted them to be interested in too. One of my great guilts as a parent is my oldest son was in cross country in high school, and I thought that was really a great activity for him. Cross country is an individual sport, gives you a lot of self-confidence. It was a really good coach and team, so a lot of camaraderie, and he'd been kind of a loner up to that point, so he really joined in. But he was also in the band. And what I didn't realize his senior year is that he actually liked band better than he liked cross country. So I would go to all the cross country meets, but I didn't want to pay to get into the football game to watch the band's halftime show. So I'd watch from the sidelines when I did, and now I kind of regret that. But overall, I didn't feel like I had a strategy for parenting. I had I had results without any good sense to get there. I just feel like I'm lucky, but I think every parent's lucky. A really strict parent could have a kid who just turns out awful, and one who's really loose could have one that turns out great, and vice versa. I got into big arguments with my when I was going to get married. I had this argument with a friend of mine who hadn't got married yet, and we were talking about raising children. And he didn't believe that anything that you did to raise a child made any difference at all, because I was concerned about, well, I want to make sure that we live in an area where the schools are good and stuff. And I think I've kind of come around to his way of thinking, that the kids kind of go the way they do, and you just try not to wreck them.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I also didn't really have a strategy. Well, that's not true. I had all kinds of beliefs before I got married and had a child. I knew everything about everything, including parenting, because I was that age. And all of that quickly went out the window once I had my own child. But mostly it was all experimentation, all learning as you go. And we only had one kid, so we never had another kid who would get the benefit of our experience with the first one. But my main goal as a parent was not to be like my parents, and I tried very hard. And back to the topic of creativity, we always encouraged Daniel, excuse me, to do what he wanted, to pursue his interests, intellectual interests, and anything else, which my parents never did. And I was, whereas Leonore and her parents, my wife's parents, were very encouraging to their children that way. And that's definitely what I wanted to do with my child, and we did. We never told him what to read and what not to read, and what to explore and what not to explore. And even when he did decide to take the physical activity, which ended up being Taekwondo, that was his own choice. He naturally, being a natural born researcher, he researched all the different kinds of martial arts and decided which one he wanted to pursue, and that's what he did. We encouraged him to, and we let him have his head.
My son, the youngest, is 15. Like I said, he was given a writing assignment in middle school, and he was like, Dad, they want me to write a story, and I said, well, great. How many chapters? And he goes, it's a page. It's a 1-page story because it's middle school. And I'm like, all right, well, I don't know what we can do. What do you want to write about? And he said, the teacher said we should write about something about what a character would do in our favorite television show. And he liked, I forget the name of it. There's a little smartass kid with a British accent with a football-shaped head. I don't know what that is, but he's always plotting on how to kill his parents. And so Ian is not neurotypical. Neither am I. We're on the spectrum a little, which I think helps unlock creativity and the ability to see things that others may not. So I've always encouraged him to consider that oddity, that quirkiness, as a strength and not as a weakness. It's not a disorder. I keep telling him, just do what you want. Remember, you have to, clean it up for normal people. And so he wrote a story about Stewie. That's the kid's name, Stewie, taking a baseball bat to his parents and actually killing them. And I got a very concerned call from his English teacher who said, I'm sitting with Ian in the office and we had a little incident today at school. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what brilliant thing did he do that you don't understand? And so she didn't like that at all. I started off that conversation appropriately. And sure enough, she told me about the story that he had written. And there's very big concerns after Columbine and after the Arapahoe shooting, which is a mile away. He wrote this very violent story about killing his parents, and we're concerned for your safety. And then I heard Ian say, this is stupid in the background because it was on speakerphone. And I said, oh, can Ian hear us? And she said, yes. And I said, Ian, tell me what the story is about. And it's about Stewie wanting to kill his parents, and they never let it happen on the television show. So I wrote a story in which he did. I said, do you want to kill me or your mom? He said, no. And I said, okay, Mrs., I forget her name. Why were you upset about the story? She said, it was so chilling in its realism and its violence. It was so descriptive. I'm like, hold on a second. You were moved emotionally by the words that he wrote. You believed it so much that you had a visceral reaction. She said, yes. And this is why I'm calling you. I'm like, so you're giving him a prize, right? There's some sort of reward because he wrote what you told him to do and it was well done. Yes. And there was silence. She goes, I didn't think about it that way. I said, all right, well, let's think about that and call me back with your decision. So that was the end of it. He got home that night. He was livid, just livid. But that's how I encouraged his creativity. It's cool. So it was me standing up for him against a hostile teacher. I don't know if that's a great story, but it's true.
I love it. Having had hostile teachers.
The teacher part of me is flinching.
I know. I'm sorry, James. I adore you. I'm sorry. That's what happened.
I had teachers who tried to squelch my creativity because I didn't write anything quite like that, but I didn't write what they wanted to read and didn't fit their preconceptions. And yeah, they thought you shouldn't be trying to even thinking about being a writer. I remember telling one of those teachers that, and I was quite young, that I wanted to grow up and be a writer, and she obviously disapproved of that idea because of the kind of things I wrote in class.
Well, I'm proud of you for doing it.
There are good teachers and there are bad teachers, and then there are trapped teachers. That sounds like a bad teacher.
Oh, yes, mine was trapped. I believe mine was trapped because of the Columbine things. I think she was just like, there's a hard no about anything to do with violence. And I think there's a place for that. I do.
Yeah, she had less latitude probably than teachers before Columbine had.
Yeah.
I know I had a student who wrote about his father once, and this is in high school, and he was a very smart kid, very sophisticated kid, but he wrote all this stuff. It was like Sylvia Plath, but from a male point of view, directed at his dad. And how his dad is comparable to Nazis and just all this gruesome, really awful image. And it was wonderfully written and it fulfilled every part of the assignment that I gave. So I wrote comments on it and we talked about it, and I tried to do what I could to make sure I wasn't looking at pathology at work, which I probably was. And then he got an A on the assignment, and everything would have been fine, except that one day his dad found it. And so his dad's reading this stuff about very vividly how much his son is saying in this essay he hates him, and I had written A on it. So teachers get a little stuck too. I imagine Stephen King's teachers had faced problems when they looked at the stuff he was turning in. In fact, as he talks about it in On Writing, it says that he and teachers didn't have a great relationship.
Well, I remember a teacher objecting, not because what I wrote was violent, but because it was zany and goofy and silly. It had zany characters saying funny things and kids going through a scary yard in a weird house and at night, and the man coming out and yelling at them and saying crazy things. And I thought I was having fun. I always liked writing humor even as a kid, and I was just having a ball. And I turned that in, and she told me, "You're not writing for the funny papers now. You have to write seriously."
James Thurber was writing hilarious. The dog that bit people and others, and those she's a bad one. She's a bad one.
She was a bad one. It was a long time ago.
Yeah.
I have a ton of stories of teachers or administrators or somebody at school that just did not get my kids at all. And the number of times I heard from the administrator's lips, this is not a problem we have with the other kid in the school. And I'm like, I know that's not true, because I know my kids aren't the only ones doing this. So you can't tell me that. But I heard it all the time. It's like, no other kid does this. Yeah, they do. Yes, they do.
Well, don't you think that there's a real possibility that because who we are, this panel, that we raised children in homes that fostered unique points of view? I mean, growing up in science fiction and fantasy and imaginative literature and people who value those things and discuss those things. I mean, actually show their valuing of that because they collect them and they get enthusiastic about it. I think that creates kids who do look a little square peggish in the round hole schools. And good teachers need to recognize that. I think good teachers need to value diversity. When I was teaching writing, I told them writing is the weirdest subject to teach, because I'm going to show you models of good writing, and then I'm going to say, but don't write this, because that's plagiarism. You know, can we find the thing that you can talk about in a way that only you can talk about it? And there are a lot of kids that doesn't work very well for them. They want to be told, you know, can I do this? Give me the description of what I need to do to get an A, and they'll do everything they can to do that. And they write uniformly bland things that will, you know, check all the boxes. What's lovely is the kid that turns in something that just says, what, how did you get to that from what I told you? Let's talk about it. And that becomes fun. But if our kids had problems in schools, and I think all kids have problems in schools, but you have to believe that some of the problems our kids had with teachers and peers came from growing up in households like ours. I mean, look at, I'm in my room here. I've got books and posters, and I think, let me see,
That's a good point about books in the house. Something happened to James. He's back.
Kids would have friends over, and the friends would say, oh my God, what's with all the books?
Yeah. Well, we had a house full of books, and we certainly never discouraged Daniel from reading any of them. Now, my parents had a house full of books as well, because my father was a great, hoarder of books of all kinds of subjects. He was a rabbi, and he had lots of giant Talmuds and so on. But he also had, he grew up in England, and he worshipped English literature, so he had books of all kinds from the 19th century and even some from the 18th and so on. They didn't approve of my reading the stuff, but they didn't really pay much attention to what I was reading. So I read everything, like like a lot of kids, reading type kids. Anything that had print on it, I read. So I just devoured everything and got this tremendous amount of reading. My personal problem was that they disapproved of anyone writing unless you were already a famous, rich, established writer. The idea that you would want to write if you weren't already established, they didn't understand that at all, and they discouraged that and thought that the goal was to go out and get a good job and spend your life hating it and hating your life and dying.
Oh, that breaks my heart. That just does. I'm glad you found the path you took. I am.
I married well. That helps.
Yes, that helps. Yeah.
So if somebody came to you, if another creative type person came to you and asked you for some advice on parenting, you know, particularly parenting creative kids, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, I like a dangerous question.
Yeah, I like James's response.
Which
the free range.
Yeah, well, as I said, yeah, I'm free range, but some parents just can't live with that. I had trouble living with it too, depending on the circumstances. Like if we went hiking and there was anything that looked like a drop off, I became the most, tightly controlling parent in the world, because drop offs freak me out, and kids hurting themselves freak me out. But, in other ways, I said, let them, follow their muse and encourage them to have a muse. As I said, all three, I was lucky in a way, because, David, you said you only have the one and you didn't get to try the things that you learned on the second. I think I can tell you that none of the things you learned from the first would help with the second. They're all freaking different. But, I guess telling parents to lighten up, for me, would be the best advice, but it won't work for every kid, because sometimes lighten up means they get into drugs or crime or something, and then they'll come back to me and said, oh man, I lightened up and I should have been firmer. I should have put him in military school.
I don't know.
That's good. Go ahead.
Just real quickly, Pat Conroy's the Great Santini, followed by the Lords of Discipline. I agree with you more, I think, James. I think if you crush a kid into the mold you want him to be in, I think you're going to end up with a kid that hates you the rest of their life. And David, I wanted to hear what you had to say next.
Well, I was going to say, that's the tension that every parent deals with all the time, isn't it? how to get out of the way and yet how to protect at the same time, how to guide without controlling. I mean, and I think every parent ends up years later looking back and saying, did I do it right? And thinking, no, I probably made all kinds of mistakes. You know, we all learn all the time, and that's in our case, that's what we're learning, how to get out of the way, but not too far out of the way.
I think I'm a better parent to my third child than I was to either my first or my second. And I've had sit down conversations and lunches with my now adult children and said, you may notice that I'm way more lenient with Ian than I ever was with you. And I wanted to tell you first, I'm sorry, because I should have been as lenient. I just didn't know what I was doing. And they laugh and they go, yeah, Dad, we know, we were there. And I'm like, yeah, but I really didn't know that I didn't have to be so strict. I didn't really know that the things that I loved weren't necessarily the things that you loved. And now I'm letting Ian just follow his own muse, like you're saying, David. And they go, well, it's fine. You turned out okay. And they still talk to me. And that's really, really good. You know, the older ones still talk to me. And my older son, who's 24, now reaches out to ask me to help him with things that I offered to teach him when he was in his early teens. We're going to replace the sink faucet. Do you want to help? No. Now he's like, Dad, I need to replace the sink faucet. Will you come do that with me? I'm like, yes, I will. Yes, I will.
Yeah, what goes around comes around, right?
Yeah. Sometimes
I think that discussions with my kids now that they're adult involves me wanting to apologize all the time.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm sorry. I wish I'd done this differently when you were growing up. I wish I'd known more. I wish I'd been smart. I wish I'd been more attentive. I think I could do them all over again and do better. I don't know if I adopted a child now, who knows what would happen. They'd outlive me is what would happen. I wouldn't make it to their college graduation probably. If they went for their doctorate. Let me see, how old am I now? How many years would that be? Yeah.
You better stick around for a long time. That's all I'm saying.
Well, that's my hope. I found out today that my wife's works first grade teacher, and in her first grade team, one of her other first grade teachers, husband and two kids now appear to have COVID. And my wife hangs out with this woman in close contact most of the time. So our greatest fear in the COVID thing would be that my wife would bring something home that I would catch. So now I keep testing my symptoms. Do I feel like I need to cough? Can I taste this? No, so far so good.
Good. You keep it up.
Yeah.
Stay healthy.
Yeah.
Stay healthy. So, okay, so that's the advice you give to somebody that's, creative, probably becoming a parent. What advice would you give about helping your children to be creative without, getting controlling or getting too much into things?
I got a thought on that because my 15-year-old we're running through that right now. He's going to Cherry Creek High, and it's been there 9 weeks of the school year, and he's not made any friends yet. And I'm asking him, why not? When you go in the lunchroom, there's a whole bunch of kids there. Which ones do you want to hang out with? Let's go through the priorities. What are you looking for? And I said, I'll start because still a little controlling. I said, you're going to want somebody where there's laughter at the table. You don't want to hang out with the people that are grumpy. You want to find laughter. And he's listening to me with his his AirPod, those little Q-tips that look like they're jutting out. And I'm like, okay, so do that. And then you want to look for the people that aren't like cookie cutter. They're not normal. You don't want to hang out with normal people. You'll never get along. Right. And so he's listening to me. He goes, They have to have a lot of different adventures, and they each have to like each other's adventures, or at least allow them to have it without trying to change them. And then he's like, yep. And then he kept agreeing with me. This is on the drive home. I picked him up, and this was just last week. And I said, and the third thing, because now he was just too agreeable, and I thought he's either tuned me out or I'm actually hitting on all cylinders. And I was like, they have to like to write. And he goes, stop right there. So I was like, so he hadn't tuned me out. But he agreed that he needs to find folks that are wildly divergent in their creative joys, that there's a lot of laughter coming from that table. And I said, just find that table and plunk your tray down and sit down with them and say, I couldn't help but hear you guys laughing. What is so funny? And then just that's where their friends will be. So that's my advice to the kids who are creative.
That's to the kind of kid who can do that. Some kids aren't capable of sitting down at a table full of strangers.
Yeah.
I don't know. You just have to hope that somehow they'll find compatible friends.
Yeah.
My friends were all odd, just like me when I was a kid, and so my son's friends were kind of odd, just like him, and odd birds seem to flock together.
Yeah.
I told my kids that for friend seeking that they needed to look at their friends, the people who they want to hang out with, or the ones they're hanging out with, and then step back and say, what kind of people are these? Because your friend group tells you a lot about who you are. So if you're hanging out with a bunch of people, and when you think about it, you go, well, yeah, they're terrible students, they're kind of losers, and they're always negative. That's probably you too. You need to, your friends. I was lucky when I was in school. I hung out with people who generally were positive and wanted to, move on. If I hung out with a bunch of people that were really apathetic, then I would have, mirrored that. I would have echoed it back to them. I don't know that it's much good to tell a kid that, except that my oldest, when he went from middle school to high school, or junior high to high school, completely rewrote his life because he was going to high school of choice. So the friends that he had when he was in junior high didn't follow him. And he talked to me about this. He said, he looked at him and he said, I don't want to be that. I think that, I like those guys, but I don't like the way they were living. I'd like to find different people to hang with. And he did. And it was that cross country team, which was a very different group. And that was so helpful for him. I think but I watched him rewrite himself. And he's interesting that way. He came downstairs when he was like, I don't know, 16 or something. And my wife and our bedroom's downstairs, and he came down. He wanted to have a talk with us, and it was clear he was upset. He'd been crying, and he said, "What's going on?" And he said, "I deleted my World of Warcraft account," and he'd been playing World of Warcraft for like 4 years. We got fast internet because of World of Warcraft, and he said, "I just thought it was taking up too much of my life, too much of my time." And I've spent the morning saying goodbye to all the people who I campaigned with. And he was really upset. But I thought, oh, hey, what character he's displaying there, that he's making these choices for himself and moving on in different ways. And I saw so many kids that I taught who couldn't do that for themselves. They didn't seize control. And I don't know what I did, if anything, or what my wife did, if anything, to help him to be the kind of person that you say, I would like to be different, and so I will. And then he went ahead and did it. I wish I'd know, because I'd love to share that with other parents. I'd love to share that with the parents of kids I taught. Here's how you can take a kid who seems to be going down a path that's not healthy, and it's going to take a long time to dig out of the hole that they've created. Here's what you might say to them so that they can say, I'd like to remake this bit of myself.
I love that story.
Yeah, it's a good story. How do you think, or has it, being a creative parent, has that influenced or been reflected in your work, or had nothing to do with it? Or, what do you think?
I think I missed the first part of that question. There was a comment in the chat, and I was trying to read that and listen. I missed it. So could you?
How has being a creative parent influenced your work, or has it been reflected in your work, or just no, not really?
So, consciously, I mean, it probably shows up in characters in my books without my being aware of it, but not consciously, no.
You go ahead. You go ahead, James.
I think it does show up sometimes. Like, I've written a couple stories that I was clearly thinking about my relationship with my wife. And I've written some stories where I know that I was thinking about what it meant to be a parent. And maybe the parent in the story and the child in the story weren't me and weren't one of my children, but the story itself was heavily influenced by that. Probably when I write about fathers and sons, I write more about my father and me as a son than I do about me as a father and my children as sons. I owe my oldest story a dragon, or my oldest son a dragon story. I told him like when he was 10, I would write him a dragon story. I still haven't written it, and he still asks me about it. And it's been 2 decades, so I really need to get that done. And that would, if I had done that, then I could say, yeah, I wrote a story on command for my son. My middle son, a very thoughtful kid, a really smart kid, really bright kid. They're all really bright kids, but bright in different ways. Was watching me write a story once, and he said, "Dad, I read about the Hugo and Nebula Award. Why don't you write a story that wins one of those?" And he was like, he was in high school when he asked that question.
It's
And
reasonable.
I said, "Oh, that's brilliant."
Yeah.
So I wrote a story called "This Story Will Win a Hugo," and that came from his suggestion. And I thought, boy, it would be so awesome to win a Hugo. We're at the Hugo Awards, they said, and now accepting the award for short stories, this story will win a Hugo, and it's winning the Hugo by, and then I could go from there. That would have been great fun if I could have done that. And I really liked the story too. I thought it's good. So
Was it? What Was it nominated?
no, it was
Oh.
not. I'm sure I nominated it. I might have.
Of course. Of course. Get
Yeah, I was waiting for the punchline there.
Yeah, I wanted to hear that.
It was. I mean, I was able to sell it, and then it was picked up to be reprinted in an anthology.
That's
So there were those successes, but that came from a suggestion directly from one of my kids to, write a story. So I wrote this story on command because I was intrigued with the idea of titling a story, "This Story Will Win a Hugo," and see if I could pull it off.
Yeah, can you imagine that the winning story is so formulaic that any one of us could, okay, all right, we're going to put aside the things that we love to write this story specifically for that role. I can't.
Well, one of the characters in the story was a science fiction writer who was working with a scientist, and she was doing research for her next story, but she was really analytical about Hugo winners. And so part of the discussion in the story is she's saying, well, these are elements I see in Hugo winners and what's going on in the science part of this story. And so that was a great deal of fun to write. It was very, there's a lot of fan service in that story, I think, because I got to drop names all over the place. I would have thought it would be funnier if "This Story Will Win a Hugo" had won the Nebula. I'd have been excited about that.
And rejected entirely.
Modern version, it would be an AI, an artificial intelligence that's fed all the previous winners, and then turns out the winner. And then I don't know how it would accept the prize. That's a different problem.
How depressing that story would be.
Some paragraphs would be written by a Harlan Ellison analog, others by a Bradbury-esque analog, then Heinlein with his very strict, and then do this, and my God, standard on your own 2 feet, and then Asimov dreamily talking about caves of steel. I would say my day job is as a recruiter, and one of the things that I do on a daily basis is read through dozens, if not hundreds, of resumes, trying to find that proverbial needle in a haystack. And in that haystack, I want to find somebody who I think is a good fit for whomever the hiring manager is. So when I get the job order, I have to talk to the hiring manager because otherwise I don't know what I'm doing. It's not just a list of technical skills, for example. It's about the holistic approach. And one of the things that came to me a couple years ago was the concept of Sonder. And I don't know if you guys know that name, but Sonder, and I think it's a made-up word, basically states that it's the feeling that hits you when you're walking down a crowded sidewalk in a busy metropolitan environment, and you realize with utter clarity that every single person that you can see all around you have lives equally, if not more, complex than your own, and that they are a compendium of all of their experiences. And suddenly they're no longer faceless mannequins getting in your way because you want to make it to the bus stop. They are each amazing worlds unto themselves. And that's like, boom. And now I take that into account when I'm reading resumes. I'm like, who is the person, the many-leveled, many-layered person behind this ridiculous document that's a page and a half long? And so I think that that's what I take creatively, and being a creative parent, because like James said, each of my children are absolutely different from one another, to recognize that this individual isn't one of a cookie cutter stamp. This is somebody worlds unto themselves. And that helps me in my day job.
Well, some famous French novelist, I wish I could remember who it was, said something like, "There's no man whose life would not make an interesting novel." Of course, it all depends who writes it, I guess. I guess equally, there's probably no one whose life would not make a boring novel if it's boringly written, right?
Or look at The Old Man and the Sea. Could you imagine if we hadn't gotten into his head? He's that pathetic drunk that lives on the beach, and that's it. That's all anybody in his town ever saw of him. But when he was out there and we're there and he's done the unimaginable, and now he's got to deal with the consequences of the unimaginable and bring that home, that enormous trophy, that enormous prize, the thing he'd been searching for forever, and to have it torn from his grasp because, just because. I mean, that is a majestic, heroic story. But if you just looked at it from the point of view of the boy on the beach waiting for the old man to come back in, it's just like, I caught something, but I lost it. That's it. But it's really more than that. Sorry.
What?
No, that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. When before we had kids, my husband and I had talked about it, and we decided that our philosophy on raising children was that we were not raising children, we were raising adults. The whole point of this exercise was the end product should be an adult human being able to contribute to society. Did you have any kind of a philosophy for raising your kids or anything you'd like to share?
I saw a great cartoon. It's just recently. I wish I'd seen it when I started parenting. It showed a couple and a little girl. And this little girl says, "Daddy, can I play with your tools?" And Dad says yes. And then off on the side you hear crash, bang, rip stuff. And the mom says, "Oh, this won't end well." And the dad says, "No, it won't begin well, but it's going to end great." And the last panel is you see this grown up, the little girl grown up, and she's wearing a tool belt. She says, "Dad, I got the roof fixed." And I love that cartoon.
Yeah, I see that. Yeah, it's a great
Well,
cartoon.
everything goes. It's a really good idea. My own dad had a tendency to want you to be good right from the beginning, and that was hard to live with because he was. I think everything came out of love, and it was all intended well. But it was hard to live with his criticism or his lack of. He could never just say, "That's cool" or "That's interesting, tell me more." That just wasn't his style. He had to tweak it and throw it back. And I was thinking, I didn't want a parent like that. I didn't want to be a parent like that, and I tried not to. I also didn't make my kids clean their plates or make them eat food they didn't like because of my parents. Those were the things. But I don't know that I had a philosophy. My wife, thank goodness, was the same way about food, and that turned out to be a big thing because we had to go to my parents' house for dinner sometime, and they were big on everybody's got to eat whatever's there. So we'd spend the whole time prepping our kids. Your grandma's going to give you a meal. You may not like it, but eat it because it's going to be hard to deal with grandma and grandpa if you just put it aside.
Well, if I had a philosophy, it was don't create a role for your child to play and then force him to play it, a role in life, because my parents were literally old world parents, and everyone played a role. The parents had their predefined roles, predefined for generations. The children had their roles, and the life path was laid out and all that. And that was all three of my two siblings, my two older sisters and I, we all rebelled against that, and it caused lots of stress. And we didn't want to give our kid anything to rebel against. And he once told us that he never went through a teenage rebellion phase because he didn't have anything to rebel against. And that was the nicest thing he ever said to us, I think.
No, that is a nice thing.
Yeah. My kids, I pushed for them to be more and more independent the older they got. And every year for their birthday, I would say things not intended to be threats, but like, okay, more responsibilities coming because you're another year older. And it eventually ended up with my divorce because I think it's great. No, I know it sounds funny, but it was a big lesson that I learned. One of the things you have to do when you're dating somebody is to, after the second or third date, you have to nail them down on what happens when the kids turn 10. Or all right, maybe longer than the third date, but you know what I'm saying. Because my glorious ex, who is a wonderful person and a big heart, just No chores, no responsibility, just love the babies, love the babies. Well, they're 10. They're not babies. They must be empowered with the things that make them good adults, which is what Rebecca was saying. So for my now 15-year-old, and I hate to keep coming back to him, but he's really the last one I'm actually parenting. I've talked him through the four quadrants of competence: unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, conscious competence, and then unconscious competence. And he's really, really good at things he applies himself to. I'm sure all of our children, if they've really put some time into it, World of Warcraft, 4 years worth, he became very, very good at it. He had apparently so many people that he was emotionally connected to that disengaging from them was a traumatic, life-changing event. And I get where that comes from. But what I do now with my 15-year-old, when we're going to start something new, I'm like, all right, let's figure out how good you can be after you've really demonstrated how bad you are at it. So let's embrace the mistakes. Let's embrace the problems right up front, and don't let it get to you, because that conscious incompetence is the shortest of all the four phases. It's when you suddenly realize that the thing you thought you were good at, you're really not good at all. And now that you know it, now you got to fix it. And so the energy is directed towards becoming good at it. And that conscious incompetence is, like I said, the shortest amount of time from point A to the next stage, which is now you're doing it right. And you know you're doing it right because you're focusing on it. Conscious competence. So we try to push each other to become better at the thing that we're starting that's new, until we can hit that, okay, I'm doing a good job now and I'm doing it on purpose. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, very good. Are there any pitfalls you'd like to warn others about for being creative as a parent?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, but they're all anecdotes, right?
Right.
So I don't know if there's a universal pitfall. Maybe, but this isn't about being a creative parent. It's just about being a parent. I think that it's a bad idea to lose your temper,
Yeah.
Get out of control. It's a bad idea to project your bad day on your kid.
Yeah.
Try not to do those things. Don't do that. One of the mistakes I made with my oldest, my first then, and I know this is a mistake. I knew it when it was happening, because I think, channeling my dad, is when he did something that I really wanted him to learn a lesson from it. It became a sit down session and then a half-hour talk through. I think he grew to dread those half-hour talk throughs on anything. I mean, when you start something, said, well, son, if you want to grow up to be a good person, this is something you don't need to do. That's a bad conversation. I think he would have rather that I'd spanked him or something rather than start a conversation like that. But I learned, I quit doing them. That's one of the things I apologize to him for, is, I did those talk throughs with you. Instead of losing my temper, I tried to, be philosophical and deep and multifaceted with a 6-year-old.
Well, I'm sure I would be a much better parent now if I could do it all over again, but that doesn't happen.
No.
I guess, yeah, and as James said, it's really, all of this really is about being a parent, not necessarily a creative parent. The big problem is realizing, for me, I think, looking back, the big problem is realizing that the things that dominate your life are small compared to the influence, the impact you have on your kid's life. I mean, this is those 18 years, say, that you have the child with you, those are enormous in the child's life, even though maybe a fleeting period for you. And during that period, it's so tempting to focus on all these other things, your own problems, your own concerns, and not remember how important you are in that 18-year period of your child's life. That's the 18 years I'd like to do over again.
Yeah. I would say because non-neurotypical behavior exists generations back in my side of the family. I think from my point of view, I can easily step over a line of propriety without intending harm, especially if there's a word or a wordplay or a pun involved. And I have made good people very upset with me in the past because a pun was too good to pass up. or I said something outside the bounds of civility, because it was authentic, and authentism doesn't always go over well with neurotypicals. I'll just say that. So each of my children have grown up in an approach to life that's this wide, and the rest of the world wants it to be this wide. And so sometimes they lose friendships by just being themselves, because I didn't constrain their behavior to what was proper and right in the eyes of the Lord or any other authoritative figure. And so it just became, I would warn them, okay, we can say these things, but you shouldn't say these things outside of us, you know?
We got that a lot. A lot.
Yep.
Okay, we've only got about minutes left. Any last thoughts? We don't seem to have any more questions. So last thoughts?
Take your kids to conventions, let them read. I thought that the very best thing my mother did for me, and she did it for all of us, I think. She wouldn't buy me toys if I said, I want this toy. She wouldn't buy me candy if I'm in the store and I said I wanted candy. But she would always, always, always buy me a book if I asked for it.
And don't restrict what they read. Let them read anything. I read lots of comic books. I learned to read from comic books when I was young. My parents didn't approve, but they laid a good foundation for me.
I agree with James and David both. And my children have always had the opportunity to, and I would take them out for daddy weekends, and we'd go to, James, I don't know, or David, we'd go down to Kokoro in Colorado, just south of I-25 for lunch. Before we went in, we'd go to the book rack, which is a little used bookstore. And I'd say, buy any one book you want. Dad, I want these too. Buy any one book you want. So they had to really think about it and weigh them. Your son, David, would have freaked out because he wanted to stack. but Dan, yeah, I would say get one book, and then we go sit down at Kokoro and we'd all read our books. And then after Kokoro, we'd hop over next door to the book rack to the Dairy Queen. And that took 3 hours, and we would read with the ice cream. And that was our adventures. That was what we did, the three of us. So I would say let them read whatever they want, and make sure that you're there and available to answer their questions.
I'd like to thank everybody that's on the panel for all the tremendous, great contributions and the stories and all that you shared. I really appreciate it. I'd like to thank everybody at working behind the scenes real frantically at MileHiCon for making this work somehow. And thank everybody that attended the panel and listened to us. I appreciate it. And I think that's pretty much it.
Room we're in? For anybody that wants to chat in Discord afterwards, what room are we in?
I think it's Neverland. Is it Neverland? I think it's Neverland.
Okay.
I will head over there now. We had 7 people at one point. We're down to 5 right now, but I'm going to head over to that Neverland room in case there's questions. Thank you, Janet, and thank you, Gordon, for speaking up here in the Zoom chat. I appreciate that. And anybody else who's there, I'd love to hear from you guys too. We all would.
Yes, we would. Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks for moderating.
Thanks for hosting.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for hosting.